Hello, Year 11. This is the start of a series of videos that are going to be sent to you in the lead up to your exam that are going to help condense these key topics into bite-sized videos. They're going to be about 5 to 10 minutes long that act as a big overview. We're going to start with key topic 1 in paper 1, which is medicine in the Middle Ages from 1250 to 1500. The first most important thing to consider about the Middle Ages is how dominant the Catholic Church were. The majority of people in England worshipped through Catholicism. They worshipped God, they worshipped Jesus, and the church itself was a hugely dominant institution in England at the time, highly influential. The church preached about heaven and hell, they preached about sin, and they also told people that when they died, they would likely go to purgatory, kind of waiting room, waiting God's judgment, whether they went to heaven or hell. The only way to avoid going to hell was to be a good Christian, was to listen to the teachings of the church, was to go to church as well. The only issue was that most church services, or the majority of church services, were in Latin. The Bible was written in Latin, and the access to information and access to religious teachings and religious written word was only accessible to the very few. As a result of that, around 90% of the population were considered illiterate. They could not read or write, and they relied upon the church for that spiritual guidance. As a result of that, the church were able to control lots of areas of society, predominantly education, and as a result, they kept knowledge to themselves. Knowledge was not being challenged. Roger Bacon was an example of a monk who challenged some of the teachings of the church. He's imprisoned during the 14th century. The church also have a huge endorsement of the work of Hippocrates and Galen, Hippocrates being the ancient Greek doctor who develops the ideas of the four humours, and Galen, who is a Roman doctor who lives many centuries after Hippocrates, but he basically essentially becomes the main medical ideas that are used during the Middle Ages. Galen has a theory called the theory of design. This was an idea that the human body was so complicated that it must have been created by some sort of higher being, a supernatural God. The Catholic Church also preached this. They preached that God creates the world, creates humankind, and everything that we see in it as well. So Galen's idea is aligned with that of the Catholic Church. As a result of that, Galen becomes the main dominant person. His ideas are preached, but also the fall of the Roman Empire meant that lots of knowledge was lost during the Roman and Greek period. Lots of progress and knowledge was lost. Galen's work survives, as does Hippocrates as well. And as you can see there on the left-hand side, many of their ideas were written together and placed in certain books during the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance as well. The theory of the four humours, whilst being Hippocrates' idea, is massively endorsed also by Galen, and this becomes the dominant natural theory about the cause of disease, and we know that happens, that dominates medicine throughout the Middle Ages and up to the Renaissance era as well. But it's not just Galen and the theory of the four humours which are dominant during the Middle Ages. There are other ideas about disease and illness, and here are some listed as well, and we know that we have the supernatural ideas and also the naturals. These two ideas coexist during the Middle Ages. They believe in both of them. They often link the two together. So there's the idea that the movement of the planets and astrology, which becomes really popular in the 14th century and the 15th century, has an impact on disease. But this is also linked to God and the idea that God controls the universe. But there's also links between the four humours and also the planets as well. And in the bottom left there, we start to see we start to see the 12 signs of the zodiac being used. So the star signs and astrology linked to the four humours as well. So where would a doctor make the incision to bloodlet you? It will be based on your star sign. So again, there we can see the coexistence of supernatural and natural together. Top right is we're looking at the idea of purging, and most medieval physicians would often obviously prescribe this treatment to purge yourself with the system. Your humours are out of balance. They need to be back in balance. The only way to do that is to purge your system through throwing up. So throwing up yellow bile, laxatives, anything like that as well. But bloodletting is the dominant treatment that is used. Other than God and sin being a major cause, and we're going to talk about the Black Death later on, is obviously the bottom left image there, which is the miasma theory. So the theory that bad air or smells cause disease as well. This is a hugely dominant theory that's going to exist in people's minds about ideas about illness from the Middle Ages all the way through to the mid-19th century. So this is a really key idea that happens. Medieval cities and towns were really filthy places. There was a lack of understanding about hygiene, about germs. Animal waste and human waste would be found in the streets or placed into the rivers as well. There was no sanitation. There was no sewage system that had collapsed when the Romans had left, and that knowledge had been lost. So medieval towns and cities were rife for disease, and they would smell extremely bad. So the theory of miasma develops based on the infected air causing disease as well. But again, it is also linked to God. Many people would believe that God was blowing miasmic winds at times when God was displeased as well. The Black Death in 1348 is the first case study of the medicine course out of 7, and it's a really significant moment because it encapsulates all of what we know about the Middle Ages and medical thinking as well. We can't underestimate the impact of the Black Death. Around 40% of the population are killed. We're looking at a population of about 5 million at the time in England. So 40% is obviously a huge number. It had huge social impacts as well. And obviously the main idea about the disease is, and you can see that from the left-hand image as well, and also the right as well, is that God had sent the Black Death or the plague as a punishment for sin. That was the only rational explanation for why so many people were dying. And the fact that it wasn't just purging society of the poor, it was also purging society of the rich and the wealthy. No one was safe. So that's where we get this strong idea that it must have had a religious reason. And that's why we get Christians blaming the Jews as well for poisoning wells. They're making that link towards Jewish and Christian animosity, the fact that Jews had killed Jesus in the Bible, and they linked it to that as well. But we also see all of the other ideas that we've just talked about being referenced in Cause of the Plague. So the 4 humours are seen to be a reason. So purging takes place. Miasma, but God has blown the miasmic winds, the planet's moving. All of the ideas about illness during the Middle Ages are blamed on why the Black Death happens. So if you don't understand what causes disease, you can't treat it. You can prevent, and there are attempts to prevent. There's some evidence of quarantine. Edward III orders the streets to be cleaned, but again, this is not really enforced. This is not a time where government has a lot of autonomy and a lot of control in public health. There's some fines in London for butchers who are putting their carcasses into the street. But again, it's quite limited, and what we do see is supernatural kind of preventative methods and treatments, such as prayer. We see the flagellant groups on the right-hand side there, more extreme religious extremists whipping themselves. People go on pilgrimages. The church deemed that no wrestling in churchyards in Suffolk, things that would offend God. And then we see treatments and preventative methods based on miasma as well. So people carrying sweet-smelling herbs, like lavender and sage, disrupts the air to protect them. Church bells would be rung to disrupt the air as well. Bonfires lit. And obviously we have the purging and the bloodletting as well there too. Eventually the plague subsides within a few years, but it does return year on year. And the key thing is always to compare the Black Death in 1348 with the Great Plague of 1665, where you see a lot of continuity in treatment and understanding of what caused it. Were treatments. Bloodletting is obviously the dominant one, but physicians were the main people to administer bloodletting, and physicians were were private doctors in a sense, so only the very wealthy could actually afford a physician. Most people in the Middle Ages would rely on home remedies. And on the left-hand side there, we see the birth of a child, and this is the idea of the wise woman. Many towns, villages would have women who mainly excelled in medical care. They would use a range of herbal treatments passed down from generation, but also they were the main midwives as well. Later on, midwifery became dominant by men, and it would be men who would actually deliver babies. But in the Middle Ages, it was seen as the woman's task to bring people into the world in that way as well. In the middle there, we see that's the apothecary. So this is almost, we would recognize that as a kind of pharmacy. And the apothecary would have a range of different medicines on sale as well. They might use, typical herbs, quite healing herbs like fennel and mint, but they also might use things like zinc. And we start to see alchemy, the use of kind of different kind of chemicals and minerals being used in the Middle Ages, but that doesn't really take on until the Renaissance. The final one there is on the right hand side is the barber surgeon. So a barber surgeon is typically where if you were from a low income, you might go there and they might bloodlet you. But surgeons themselves were not really well respected in the medical world. That was only doctors, because doctors and physicians went to university. They studied the works of Galen and Hippocrates for 7 to 10 years. They were the learned people. Surgeons were often not educated. They were more practical. But there was one royal surgeon called John Bradmore who did actually treat an arrow wound for Prince Henry at the time, and he used barley and honey. So again, showing you those kind of herbal remedies, and that some surgeons did have success. The last thing to consider with the Middle Ages and medicine is the idea of hospitals. Hospitals didn't exist on a national level. There was no government funding for hospitals. So what we do see is we mainly saw hospitals being founded by the church. And most of the time, these hospitals were not standalone buildings, they were within monasteries. And monks and nuns would be the people administering care. The monks would generally administer spiritual care and guidance, pray for the soul. And from this image here, you can see the nuns would provide that general care as well, feeding, changing the limbs as well. But what we don't see is professional staff being used. We don't really see wards or nurses as such. That would come much later on as well. The Catholic Church directly ran about 30% of all churches. So that's not to say they controlled and ran all of them, but they were massively important in a lot of the work. And some of the most famous hospitals, even today, were founded by the church. So St. Thomas's Hospital in Westminster would provide care for unmarried pregnant women. St. Mary's of Bethlehem, which became known as Bedlam, would provide care for some of the mentally ill. And one of the most famous hospitals, which is St. Bartholomew's in the city of London, is founded in 1123, and it acts as obviously a monastic house, providing care. In the Renaissance, it eventually turns into a more professional hospital as well. So that is, in sum, all of your information, a whistle-stop tour of the Middle Ages. So tune in next time for a video and an overview of medicine in the Renaissance.